Chapter 4 Guinevere. After she received her assignment, Guinevere had hoped her mother would send her to Camelot Castle immediately so she could begin her quest to help unseat Merlin's pawn. Instead, Mim had told her it was best to wait until morning to start her journey, stating that it would be dangerous for a young girl to travel through the woods on her own in the dark, where wolves and other nasty forest creatures might be lurking. Gwen wouldn't exactly be able to save the world, she reminded her, if she became a wolf's midnight snack. Of course, Mim could zap her there immediately using magic, but Guinevere chose to decline that option, saying she should probably cook dinner first anyway. So, Gwen began to prepare their nightly meal, deciding on a hearty stew using the vegetables she found in the market. She was still secretly grateful she hadn't found any slugs. Nothing against her mother, of course, but they were just so slimy. She planned to make an extra large portion of stew so Mim could eat it while she was away. After all, she had no idea how long she'd be at the castle, and she didn't need her mother resorting to magic again while she was gone just to feed herself. After slicing and dicing the vegetables, Gwen realized she didn't have enough water for her stew, and so she set out with 2 large buckets to the well just outside of town. It was about an 8-furlong walk, but Guinevere didn't mind the trek so much. It was pleasant, after all, to feel the warm sun on her skin and fresh air on her face. It reminded her of the Forest Sauvage, where she and Mim had lived up until recently. Mim had decided one day, seemingly on a whim, to use her magic to poof their entire cottage furlongs away from its old spot and plop it down on an entirely new plot of land just outside of London, with them still inside of it. Mim insisted it was more convenient that way, rather than packing everything up and moving to a new place by horse and wagon. And Guinevere was happy to be able to keep her old room in the new spot, though she admittedly would have preferred a less jarring way to go about it. Magic. It was always so troublesome. Speaking of magic, she still couldn't believe what that dastardly Merlin had managed to get away with. Or maybe she could. After all, it was just like the evil wizard to meddle in affairs that were simply none of his business. He'd killed her parents, for one thing, and he'd tried to kill her too. Why, he'd quite recently barged into her mother's cottage with his bewitched owl for no reason at all, while Min was minding her own business playing a game of cards. He'd challenged her to a duel, forcing her mother to use her magic, then cheated by giving her a near-fatal disease. It had taken weeks for Gwen to nurse her poor mother back to health. The man had to be stopped, and if Guinevere could help in any way, why, she was more than happy to do so. She'd been longing for revenge as long as she could remember, and finally she would get her chance. She wondered what Arthur would be like. Mim hadn't allowed her to attend his coronation, so she'd never caught sight of his face. She could imagine it, though. Probably rough and scarred from the many battles he'd fought, and his shoulders would be very broad. He'd be tall, too. Guinevere was pretty sure all kings were tall, and likely bare-chested, maybe with a cleft in his chin. She'd pictured him draped in a heavy ermine robes and decked out in stolen jewels as he sat languidly on the throne, working to destroy a kingdom that he should never have been allowed to rule to begin with. But that wasn't going to happen. Not on her watch. When she arrived at the well, she realized there was someone already there. A boy, around her own age, with a mop of sandy-colored hair on top of his head. From his simple, undyed cotton tunic, woven belt, and plain shoes, she assumed he was one of the nearby villagers, come to gather water at the well. Except He didn't have a bucket, and he was peering down into the water with a strange longing on his face. She waited for a moment, hoping he'd just leave on his own and allow her to get her water. When he didn't, she eventually cleared her throat to get his attention. His head jerked up in response, managing to smack into the well's wooden roof. He let out an "ow!" and staggered backwards. Holding his head with his hands, Guinevere immediately felt bad. "I'm sorry," she cried, biting her lower lip. "I didn't mean to startle you." The boy managed to straighten, then shook himself. He looked up at her. "It's all right," he said. "My fault, really." "What were you doing?" she asked. "I was just thinking about being a fish," he replied, as if this weren't a strange thing to say to someone, especially someone you just met. I don't think there are any fish in this well," she couldn't help teasing. "I mean, I hope not, at least. It wouldn't be very pleasant for them. Or us, for that matter." She grinned. He laughed. It was a nice laugh, full and rich and hearty, unlike Mim's giggles. "You're probably right," he agreed, leaning against a nearby tree. "Perhaps a bird would be better." He looked up into the sky. Guinevere noticed his eyes were very blue. "I don't know about that," she replied, before she could help herself, remembering the time Mim had zapped her into a bird during a lesson on shape-shifting magic. Gwen still remembered how terrifying it had been to feel her body shrink in size and her bones reshape themselves. And if that wasn't bad enough, Mim had found it hilarious to pick her up and toss her high into the air, assuming she'd learned to fly before colliding back with the ground. She hadn't, it turned out, and if Mim hadn't caught her at the last moment in a magical bubble of air, she probably wouldn't even be there talking to the boy now. "Where would you go if you were a bird?" she asked, as she grabbed the well's rope and started pulling up its bucket. "I don't know," the boy mused, seeming to take the question more seriously than she'd meant it. "But wherever it was, it would be far away from here, where no one could find me." The tone in his voice sounded both sad and a little lonely. Guinevere watched as he stubbed his toe into the dirt. "Is that why you're out here?" she asked kindly. "Because you don't want to be found?" "Most definitely," he agreed with a long sigh. "Life has become, well, complicated lately. I just wanted a few moments to myself. You can imagine, right?" He gave a half laugh and looked at her as if she wouldn't understand. And she did, actually. As much as she loved her foster mother and their simple life in the forest, sometimes Gwen found herself longing for some freedom or a chance for adventure. Mim was a lot of wonderful things, but she was also very protective of her daughter, insisting she always stays close for her own safety. The world was a dangerous place, Mim would say, with evil wizards like Merlin always lurking about in the shadows. You couldn't be too careful. Quinn was appreciative of her mother caring about her so much and protecting her from harm. But still, she couldn't help wishing for more. "Do you live in the village?" she asked the boy, deciding to change the subject. "I don't think I've seen you here before." For a moment, he looked startled at the question, almost as if he had expected her to know this already. But then a small smile crept over his face. "Yes," he said. I lived in the village. My name's, Wart." "Wart?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What a peculiar name." His face turned bright red. "It's a nickname," he confessed. "Perhaps the not most flattering." Guinevere immediately felt bad. "I like it, actually," she pronounced. "It's very unique. I mean, everyone and their brother these days is a Gawain or a Galahad or a Gaheris. But I don't know a single other wart. She smiled at him. He smiled back and clearly relieved. What's your name? He asked. Oh, well, I'm Guinevere, she replied. I live just down the path with my mother in a small cottage in the woods. We come here to get well water because our well ran dry. That wasn't exactly what had happened. In truth, one of Mim's spells had backfired when they'd first arrived and left the entire well filled with green, slimy goo. The wizard was still trying to work on a reverse spell, but so far had only managed to change the goo's color to purple, which Gwen didn't feel was much of an improvement, at least when it came to drinking it. But of course she wasn't to speak of such things to strangers. That was Mim's #1 rule. Never talk about magic to mortals. They might think you dangerous, like Merlin was. They might even try to lock you up and throw away the key. In fact, they tried to do that with Mim once. Guinevere would never forget the day she came home to find her mother gone. Thank goodness Mim had outsmarted her captors in the end. She turned them all into toads and poofed herself back home. Can't help a good wizard down, she declared. And Gwen had nearly collapsed in relief. After all, her mother was all she had. And as much as she feared magic, she feared losing Mim most of all. It's nice to meet you, Wirt said, interrupting her thoughts. He held out his hand and Guinevere took it in her own, surprised at how strong his grip was. She had assumed from his thin, gangly arms and legs he would have a softer touch. Nice to meet you too, she said. Then she glanced up at the sky. Though I really must be getting my water and heading home. It is starting to get dark, and I don't want to run into any wolves on the way back. I'll walk you back, Wart proposed. They'll be less likely to attack if there's two of us. And I do have a sword, he added with a small blush, gesturing to his side. The sheathed weapon hanging there had a rather ornate hilt, the kind of hilt that likely meant the sword was quite expensive. She wondered how a commoner like him could have come into possession of such a prize. She hoped he hadn't stolen it. It's really not necessary, she hedged, knowing Mim wouldn't be pleased about her leading a stranger to their home. It's a knight's duty to serve a damsel in distress, Wart declared, puffing out his skinny chest. Guinevere couldn't help but giggle. First, I'm no damsel in distress, she scolded playfully. And second, I'm willing to wager you're not a knight. His chest drooped. He looked so forlorn that for a moment she felt bad. But I would like the company, she added hastily as she worked to fill her buckets with well water. After she said it, she realized it was true. It was a long walk, and it would be lovely to have someone to talk to along the way, especially someone as pleasant as Wart. They could get to know one another better on the journey, and then she could say goodbye to him well before the cottage came into view. Mim would never be the wiser. So what do you say? She asked. Wart's blue eyes lit up. He took one of her now filled buckets with one hand, then made a sweeping gesture towards the path with his other. Lead the way, milady, he said grandly, which made her giggle all over again. Our quest begins. Chapter 5. Arthur. What do you think you're doing? Arthur scolded himself as he followed Guinevere down the windy forest path in the direction of her home. This is pure foolishness. And it was. As king, he wasn't even supposed to leave the castle, at least not without a full complement of knights at his side, and even then, he certainly was not supposed to talk to strangers he met along the side of the road. It was too dangerous. Sir Pellinore had lectured when Arthur had first tried to set out for a stroll shortly after his coronation. After all, he was England's only hope. The country's entire future rested on his admittedly scrawny shoulders, which meant those shoulders needed to be protected. If anything happened to him, the land could fall back into a dark age, and no one wanted that. Arthur didn't want that either. But still, it was so stifling being king, to be stuck inside all day long, listening to adults drone on and on about this problem or that. Sometimes he even longed for his old life back in Sir Edgar's crumbling castle. At least there he had honest, hard work to keep him busy, and he could go outside any time he wanted without even having to tell anyone first. In a moment of desperation, Arthur had tried to sneak down to the Camelot kitchen to wash some dishes like he used to back then, but he was quickly discovered and sent back to the throne room. A king, it seemed, did not dirty his hands with menial labor. So when Pellinore and his knights had left the castle that afternoon to go follow Arthur's orders and invite the invading Saxons to dinner, Arthur had found himself in a rare position of not being watched like a hawk for once, and when he discovered a servant's door left ajar, he couldn't resist taking full advantage, slipping out of the castle and wandering into the woods. Just for a few minutes, he told himself, and he'd go right back. But then he'd met her. His eyes rose to the girl dancing down the path in front of him. She wore a plain peasant dress, unsinged at the waist, and her long golden curls tumbled messily down her back in waves, free of all the severe braids and bindings so in fashion at the castle. It was almost as if she were a wild thing, untamed by civilized life. He couldn't imagine the ladies in court ever dancing so freely, as if they didn't have a care in the world. And the best part was, she had no idea who he was, which had shocked him at first. After all, he was currently the most famous person in all the land, and so many had attended his coronation. But then, she'd said she and her mother lived deep in the woods and didn't get out much. So it made sense she wouldn't recognize him. She hadn't even recognized the sword Excalibur at his side, which meant, for a moment, he could be his old self again. Not the long-destined king of legends pledged to save the realm, but a simple boy out for a walk in the woods with a nice girl by his side. In fact, it had felt so good to be Wart again that he hadn't wanted the moment to end, and so he'd blurted out his offer to walk Guinevere back home, just to spend a few more minutes feeling normal. What if it's a trap? An annoying voice in his head nagged. Maybe she knows exactly who you are, and it's all part of a ruse. What if she is leading you into an ambush of your enemies? After all, not everyone in the land is pleased to have a young boy as their king, and they would be thrilled to get their hands on you, all alone, unprotected in a dark wood. Oh, are those violets? Guinevere asked, interrupting his worried thoughts. She leant down and plucked a handful of small purple flowers, then slipped them into a small pouch tied to her belt. I haven't found any since we moved here, and they're so great for easing one's coughs when mixed with yarrow flowers. You make medicines? Arthur asked, curious. Oh, yes. It's sort of a hobby of mine. Gwen's cheeks colored slightly. Nature provides us with so many natural gifts. You just have to know what to look for. Back home, I had a whole garden filled with herbs that I used to make potions with to help those in the nearby village. Home? Arthur queried. Are you not from around here then? We just moved here recently, she explained. Around the same time they crowned the new king. We used to live miles away from here in the Forest Sauvage. It's a wild place, but just as beautiful. Arthur stopped short. The Forest Sauvage? He repeated incredulously. Yes, Guinevere stopped and turned to look at him quizzically. Have you heard of it? I used to live there, he exclaimed, before he could stop himself. Until... His voice trailed off. Until... I came here, he stammered. He had to be careful not to give out too much personal information, just in case. But Guinevere didn't seem to notice his stammer. She was shaking her head in wonder. Wow, what a small world, she whispered, an excited gleam in her dark eyes. I wonder if we ever ran into each other back then and never realized it. I don't think so, Arthur replied. I would have remembered you. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt his face heat into a blush. Imbecile! Why would you say something like that? But then he caught her glancing at him with a shy smile on her lips, and something inside made him glad he'd said it after all. It's getting rather dark, she pointed out, fortunately changing the subject. She looked up at the sky, still painted in bands of orange and gold from the setting sun. I hope Mother isn't too worried. She doesn't like me being out at night by myself. Arthur nodded absently, a little worried himself. He never meant to stray from the castle for so long. By now, someone surely had noticed he was gone. Would they send out a search party for him? Maybe it was time to say his goodbyes. Look, he started, but trailed off as he heard a horn blowing in the distance, along with a few shouts of, Arthur! Arthur! Oh no, there was a search party, and they weren't far away either from the sound of it. Come on, he said, grabbing Guinevere's hand and urging her forwards. Let's go. She gave him a puzzled look, but complied, picking up the pace and dashing down the wooded trail. Arthur could hear the heavy clomping of hoofs behind them, sounding as if they were getting close by the sound. This was not good. What's wrong? Guinevere asked breathlessly. Why are we running? He swallowed hard. Maybe it was time to come clean. Look, there's something I should tell you, he began, but he was caught off by the horn blowing again. So close this time, he had to put his hands over his ears to block out the sound. It was then that he realized Guinevere had stopped running. She turned to face him, putting her hands on her hips. So you did steal that sword, didn't you? She accused, glancing down at Excalibur. I knew it. It's far too grand for a peasant boy like yourself, but now they're looking for you. They want to arrest you for grand theft. What? Arthur's eyes bulged. Wait, Guinevere, no. He reached for her hand, but she ripped it away. I don't associate with thieves, she spit out. Then she turned the direction in the search party. He's over here, she called. Arthur's face went pale. Shh, he cried. Please, don't attract their attention. I didn't steal the sword, I swear. They can't find me. Why not? Guinevere demanded, looking very displeased. The sounds of horses were getting closer and closer. They must have been almost on top of them. Arthur felt his knees practically give out. This had all been such a terrible mistake. Look, Guinevere, he tried, but he got no further. At that moment, they were surrounded by a group of knights, led by none other than Sir Kay, Arthur's foster brother himself. Kay smirked as he looked down from his horse at Arthur and the girls standing in the middle of their circle. Well, well, now I think I understand, he joked. Arthur felt his hackles rise. Of all people to find him, it had to be Kay. There was no one who resented his rise to the throne more than his foster brother, and Kay is constantly letting him know it. Understand what? What did this boy do? Guinevere demanded, looking fiercely from knight to knight. It was funny. Here, Arthur was terrified, and yet she didn't look one bit afraid to face off with a band of knights. Did he truly steal the sword he wears on his belt? The knights looked at her incredulously, then broke out into laughter. Arthur grinned. Guinevere's scowl deepened. What's so funny? She demanded. Sorry, milady, Sir Bors said. choking back his laughter. It's just, do you know who this young lad is? Guinevere looked over at Arthur, confused clouding over her face. Who is he? She asked, her voice suddenly a little wobbly. Why, milady, this is King Arthur, ruler of all England. And that sword he wears? He pulled it from the stone. Chapter 6. Guinevere. Guinevere stared at Wart. No, Arthur, in shock. She couldn't have been more surprised if he'd suddenly sprouted wings and turned into a bird right then and there. This was Arthur, the one who had stolen the throne of England, and she had somehow befriended him? Is it true? She managed to sputter, wanting to hear the confession spill from his own lips. She realized a part of her still held hope that maybe it was some ridiculous joke, that the knights were putting her on for their own amusement. Because surely this boy, this skinny young boy who dreamt about being a bird and flying away, couldn't be the usurper out to destroy England. Could he? Wart's face turned bright red, confirming her worst fears. Anger rose inside her, mixed with burning shame. What would Mim think if she could see her now, already falling for the charms of Merlin's pawn? Why, she was supposed to be the one tricking him, not the other way around. Her mother would be so ashamed. I have to go, she muttered. This was clearly why Mim never let her do anything on her own. She was the worst judge of character ever. She'd taken him at his word, and he'd lied to her. And of course he had. He'd lied to the entire kingdom, pretending to be their rightful monarch. Him worse. She'd believed him without question. Gwen, Arthur cried. He sounded upset. Please, I can explain. I'm sure you can, she managed to say, trying to keep her voice thick and haughty, as if his deception meant absolutely nothing to her. But I'm not interested in hearing it. And with that, she turned and walked down the path, keeping her shoulders squared and her head held high. She could hear him calling for her, but she refused to get him the satisfaction of turning around to look. Only when she heard the sounds of the knight's horses galloping away, presumably with Arthur in tow, she did allow herself to run. Down the path through the woods, not stopping for a moment until she reached the cottage. She burst through the door, out of breath, her hair windswept and her face stained with tears and dirt. She leant over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. Mim looked up from her card game, raising a bushy eyebrow. Where's the water? She asked. Oh no, the water. Guinevere looked down at her bucket to find it nearly empty. And she realized miserably she had never grabbed the second bucket back from Arthur when she fled. I'm sorry, she said. I ran into some wolves. I had to run home. I must have dropped one of the buckets on the way. She felt a little guilty lying to her mother. But what else could she say? That she'd lost their precious water because she'd accidentally befriended the kingdom's #1 enemy? If she confessed to Mim that she'd fallen for Arthur's charms, even before she got to the castle, Mim would think her a silly girl who wasn't ready to undertake such an important quest. And Guinevere needed this quest now more than ever, if for nothing else than to teach that cowardly king a lesson in manners. He shouldn't be able to get away with lying to people, and she was going to make him pay for tricking her, whatever it took. Mim sighed deeply. You know, you could have just poofed yourself home, or shapeshifted into a bird or a mouse to get away. She shook her head. You always make things so hard for yourself, my dear. Guinevere hung her head. Of course her mother would go right to magic. Magic was Mim's solution to every problem, and she couldn't understand Gwyn's reluctance to use it. In any case, I'm fine, Gwyn pointed out, though she didn't feel very fine at all. In fact, If she was being honest with herself, she felt downright miserable. She was still furious at Arthur, but also kind of sad, like she'd lost a friend just as she'd made one. Of course you are, Mim agreed. And don't worry, I'll conjure up a bountiful feast just for tonight. She gave Quinn a scolding look. Surely you could stomach a little magic if it means a full stomach. I'm thinking slug a la mode. What do you say? Guinevere nodded reluctantly. Slugs with ice cream sounded pretty horrific, but then it was her fault they wouldn't have their stew. And she didn't want to appear ungrateful when her mother was acting so understanding. Now sit down, my pet, before you pass out on me, Mim instructed, pulling a chair close to her own. Guinevere gratefully collapsed into it, and Mim took her hand, squeezing it lightly. Gwen let out a shuddering breath and closed her eyes. Wow, you were really upset, Mim noted with surprise. And all over a silly little wolf? That's not like you, my dear. Guinevere opened her eyes a crack. Her mother was staring at her suspiciously. I thought it was a dog, she stammered, until I got close to it. It surprised me. Mim's grip tightened, just a little, but enough to tell Guinevere she didn't quite believe her, which made sense, of course, since it was a blatant lie. Luckily, however, there was no way for her mother to guess the truth. Mim might have been magical, but she wasn't a mind reader. And eventually, Mim's hand relaxed again. Poor child, she soothed, stroking Quinn's palm. So frightened of the world. I suppose that's particularly my fault, keeping you so close to me all these years. She paused, then added, Maybe sending you to the castle isn't such a good idea after all. No, Guinevere cried, her eyes flying open. She jerked her hand away. I want to go. I'll be fine, I promise. You don't have to worry about me. Mim held up her hands in protest. All right, she cried with a giggle. No need to beg. I'm sure it'll be simply marvelous. I can't wait to see. She paused and added, There's one thing, however. What's that? Guinevere asked wearily, noting the change in her mother's voice, no longer laughing, but dead serious, which was unusual for Mim to say the least. Mim's eyes rested on her daughter. When you get to the castle, whatever you do, whatever you say, do not let Arthur know you are related to me in any way, no matter what happens. If he learns that I sent you, there's no telling what he'll do to you. Or me, for that matter. She gave Gwyn a strong look. Arthur may only be a boy, but at the end of the day, he serves Merlin. You do best to remember that. I understand, Gwyn said softly, feeling a shiver trip down her spine. You could trust me. I won't let you down. That's my girl, Gwyn cried, her demeanor changing again. She leapt to her feet. Now, let's eat. Can't save a kingdom on an empty stomach, can we? She waved her arms wildly in the air. Bring on the slugs.